Hello. Inflation is in the headlines. We hear about interest rates going up and there's inflation, the cost of food's going up. We hear about labor, there's strikes. So inflation is something that we're experiencing. It's been happening some degree since the beginning of the pandemic with the changes in the shipments that changed the supply chain. But we've also seen labor going up over that period, and now we're seeing strikes. So inflation has become a thing of the last few years. Before the pandemic, we really hadn't heard about inflation for at least 30 years. It just wasn't a big impact in our lives. And I'm old enough that if you go back to the 80s, I actually bought a house when mortgage rates were 12%, when the prime rate was over 20%. Think about that. The prime lending rate, those of you that are familiar with the prime lending rate, that's the best rate you can borrow from a bank for the more creditworthy businesses. That's pretty much the lowest price you can borrow at. And for most of the last 25 years, the prime rate has been under 5%. In the 80s, it was over 25%. So most people who are running businesses these days really have never experienced inflation. And while we think of it as something that affects our budget and our personal budget, can people afford things, are going to change their buying behaviors, those are true. Those are true and those are important. But it also changes some things about how you run your business. One of the things that if you're selling a service or selling products and you're just not long-term contracts, not a complicated situation, you're selling pizzas, you're selling a retail product, you're selling, widgets that you've got on hand, whatever, it might be pencils, you need to raise your prices because your costs are going up. It costs me more to buy the pencils, it costs me more to buy the ingredients for the pizza and the labor to make the pizza, and so I have to raise my prices. That makes sense. That makes sense. And the question is, can I raise my prices without scaring off customers? That's a good question, and if your costs are going up, you probably can, because most of the time your competitors' costs are going up. So that's kind of the obvious next step from, it costs more to buy things. Well, now I need to pass those costs along. Pretty straightforward, pretty straightforward. When things get a little bit more complicated is when you have long-term agreements. When you have you're bidding on something and you're going to agree to pay, to provide it for a whole year or maybe multiple years. You say, okay, there's a project to build a new pipeline, and it's a pretty big pipeline. It's going to take several years, or it's a steel plant or one of these big chip fabs, and it takes years. And so you're providing whatever it might be, chairs. You're providing chairs for this project, and so as it's completed in phases, you're agreeing to provide the chairs, and you're like, well, I know what they cost now, but I don't know what they're going to cost 2 years from now when I'm going to have to deliver a bunch of these chairs. How do I do that? How do I build that in? Well, there's a number of tools you can use. One is a cost of living adjustment. COLA is the acronym, COLA. So cost of living adjustment. And this is actually a number. There's a factor that the government provides that tracks this over time. And 40 years ago, this was a really big deal. It was commonly used in contracts and say, okay, we will adjust our prices for our service or our products based on this COLA adjustment, this cost of living adjustment. So for 2022, the COLA might have been, I don't know what it was, but maybe 7%, which is much higher than the 2% inflation we're used to. And so, and it might be 5% or it could be 10% next year in 2024, 25. And so you can use that and build that language into your contracts that we will adjust our prices using the COLA adjustment. So that is a tool that you can use. It's really important to think about that when you're bidding long-term agreements, whether it's a service or a product. And you might think about the impact if you're importing goods, the impact of a tariff. If all of a sudden the government puts a 10% tariff, is that going to drive your cost of bringing raw materials or finished goods into the country? And thus, your price, are you going to be losing money? Even if you say we've got a COLA adjustment, so the, general price level increased by 10%, but on top of that, my particular product got an additional tariff of 10 or 20%. And have I built that in? So these are things that with inflation, you need to think about as strategies when you're bidding longer term agreements with your customers. Hope that's a helpful tip. Let me know what other tips, what other issues you're thinking about, and love to hear your comments in this video. That's all for today.